She's from the World Apostolate of Fatima. She goes around and speaks to people about the story of Fatima, and we're gonna hear from her today. But let's begin our morning here.
I should lead us.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Spirit. Hail Mary,
full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
thank you guys. So let's give a round of applause for this part.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. This message of Fatima is an Marian apparition that happened over 106 years ago. And you may wonder, why is this still important today? But Pope John Paul II said, it is incumbent upon the church that this message be spread. It's not because you have to believe that Mary appeared at Fatima. It's because it's the gospel message. So I even tell my kids who are now in their 20s, I say, you don't have to believe anything about what happened in that time, but I do want you to believe in the gospel. And so the Blessed Mother came to Fatima in May 13th, 2017 to October 13th, 2017. And she came because of a special, we were entering into the 20th century. It was the first time in mankind's history that we were going to build weapons that could destroy the world. Nuclear weapons. We were in a world war at the time. People were being killed at massive numbers. Pope Benedict XV could not do anything to get the world leaders to listen to anything regarding peace. And so he asked the Catholic world to pray the rosary, a novena of rosaries. On the 8th day of that novena, Our Lady appeared at Fatima. And her message was, continually pray the rosary for peace, especially to obtain peace in the world. And this became known as the peace plan from heaven. So here we are in 2024, and what's going on in the world? We've got two big conflicts, Russia and Ukraine. We got the Israel and Hamas. Both of these could flare up into a world war, just like it was happening back in the 20th century. And so to realize that our Blessed Lady came at a particular time in mankind's history because we needed her so much. And she's working behind the scenes, and she wants to be with us. And so I'm going to tell quickly the story of Fatima. I got a video I'm going to start out with. And then I just want to make sure that you understand when you leave what happened there. I'm going to talk about some of the miracles and also some of the miracles that are happening today.
The first time they saw Our Lady was on May the 13th. And Our Lady told them not to be afraid, said that I'm from heaven, and that she wanted them to come in that place every month on the 13th.
The names were Jacinta, Francisco, and Lucia. And the apparitions of Our Lady went on every month on the 13th until October.
The children heard this message from Our Lady, and the children wanted the people to believe. They wanted the people to know that this was from heaven.
And so Our Lady had promised them that during her last appearance she would perform a miracle for everyone to see.
The miracle of the sun happened in October on the 13th.
It was a rainy day. It was a miserable day. And yet everybody packed into the Kaaba to see what was going to happen.
The three children spoke with Our Lady and suddenly Lucia talked to all the people who were there, look at the sun, look at the sun. And then the sun started to spin around.
As the sun started to dance and to move about, it appeared that it was going to fall to the earth. When they began to confess themselves, they began to feel that this was it.
And then, of course, at the last second, it turns around and goes back up into the sky.
And suddenly, after the apparition, after this phenomenon of the sun, they looked at each other and they were completely dry. And there was no mud, there was no rain, there was nothing anymore.
My grandmother was there on that day, and she remembers seeing like petals of flowers floating around. People wanted to collect them, but they couldn't.
It was more than just a miracle. There were 70,000 people there. It proved that what they were saying was true.
Okay, now I need technology help. So I want to talk about that miracle. It was the only miracle ever predicted at the exact time, date, and place since the resurrection. And it was known as the day the sun danced. Lucia was the oldest of the three seers, and she was the one who spoke to Our Lady. She was the one suffering the most because so many people were mocking her. I mean, here she is 9 and 10 years old, and she's being mocked and treated so terribly by people in the village. And so she kept pleading with the Blessed Mother, you know, can you please tell us who you are, and would you perform a miracle? So Our Lady said she would do that in October. And the interesting thing about this miracle, the local mayor was a godless Freemason. He was involved with communism and atheism. The church at the time was under great persecution under this government in Portugal. And the priests were afraid to talk about what was happening in Fatima because their churches would have been shut down. They would have been banned. They would literally lock the doors and the people couldn't come to the churches anymore. And so there was a lot of fear going on at the time. Kind of similar to what's going on now, and we're sometimes afraid to speak out against things happening in our culture. We're going to get canceled, we're going to be mocked, we're going to be called racist, we're going to be hated. That was the same type of fear that was happening in Fatima at the time. And so Lucia was bearing the brunt of a lot of these sufferings. The mayor was he couldn't stop the pilgrims from coming each month. And every month the crowds got bigger and bigger. So finally he turned to his friends in the media, and they were godless people too, anti-religious. And they started writing about what was happening and mocking it, of course, making fun of religion. But what happened was it had an adverse effect in that people all over Portugal now suddenly started knowing what was happening there. And so when they mocked that there was going to be a miracle that was going to happen, people started coming in droves. So 70,000 people started walking to Fatima, sometimes from 100 miles away. They didn't have a lot of cars back then. They came by ox carts and donkeys, horses, whatever, but they kept flowing into Fatima the night before the scheduled miracle. It was pouring rain. They were up to their ankles in mud, and they just kept coming. The soldiers kept trying to stop the people, but the pilgrims just kept pushing through to the point where you saw the images of 70,000 people in this place. Lucia then and the children had their vision of Mary. She asked for a chapel to be built there. she again asked for the rosary to obtain peace. She said, I am the Lady of the Rosary. The Lady of the Rosary refers to Our Lady of Victory. It has to do with the great battle that was won by the Christian world against the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, back in the 1500s. And so she's asking us, she's giving us a spiritual weapon for our time. She's promising peace through it, including peace in your own hearts and peace in your families and in your neighborhood. Then Lucia, Our Lady said, do not offend the Lord our God anymore. He is already too much offended. And she started to rise to the east, just as she did on all occasions. And that's when Lucia saw her spread her hands and a light went up toward the sun, and she cried out, look at the sun. Well, that's when the people started to look up in the sky, and the clouds broke apart. The sun emerged after pouring rain all night long. It started to spin, and they were able to look at the sun without hurting their eyes. And slowly the sun just kept spinning, and eventually it started to cast colors all over the land. So it was like a fire wheel casting purple and blue and red and orange. And people said they'd look out over the crowd and they'd see everybody would be green or purple or red. So you're talking a massive crowd here. Well, then it started to zigzag in the sky. That's why the reporter reported 2 days later, the sun danced in the sky. So it was doing a zigzag. And then it started to plunge to the earth. And that's when people fell to their knees thinking it was the end of the world and they were confessing their sins. It went on for about 10 minutes, and then eventually the sun went back into the sky. 70,000 people were still soaking wet, but a great wind came through, and it dried their clothes, it dried up the ground. It was almost like Elijah when he called down the fire from the sky on the altar when he was taking on the 150 false idols of Baal, and the sun sucked up the water into the sky. And so there's a lot of tie-ins to things, miracles that God has done before, but all the people were dry. They said their clothes were like they'd just been through the cleaners. So this great miracle happened. Many people saw it. Jesus performed many miracles. Jesus rose, people would be raised from the dead. You can imagine being at a funeral and your dead relative is there and suddenly this man comes along and they're risen from the dead. And he cured cripples, he cured people that were blind, he cast out demons. But a lot of people still would say, give us a sign, give us a sign. It wasn't enough for them. So we have to realize that God is wanting to work in our lives. He's present in our lives. He wants to walk with us. And he performs little miracles for us every day. We don't always recognize them, but it's what we're going to do with them. Miracles are like a direction that God wants to point us. They're not there for us to be wild and then go on to the next thing. And we can get that from AI these days, can't we? I mean, it's going to become very confusing on what's real and what's not as we go forward. But I want to talk about 3 people that were there that day. The man on the left, this guy here, his name is Dominic Reese. He was 17 at the time. He had walked there from Porto, which is about 20-30 miles north of Fatima, came with his parents. And as they were pushing their way into the crowd, the soldiers were there with bayonets and they were trying to push him back. And he put out his hand to stop the soldier from hurting his dad. And he got a scar on his hand that he had his whole life. As he was watching the crowds, and as the sun came down, he heard the people crying out. He turned and looked at the crowds and he saw the sun literally touch his shoulder. He said he could feel the heat. And he felt it was so important what had happened that day. 17 years old, he thought, there was a reason I saw this. And so he decided to move to America. He spent the rest of his life spreading the message of Fatima, talking about what happened. He appeared on TV shows, radios during the 50s and 60s. The man he's sitting with there is the founder of our apostolate, John Hafford. He had a TV show in New York back in the 60s. And he gave his witness about what had happened. His witness today you can find on YouTube. So his voice is still witnessing to the miracle 106 years later. This man here, his name is Alfonso Vieira Lopes. He was a famous Portuguese poet. He was part of the elite class in Portugal, partly because he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. And he had the privilege of being able to have status in the country. But he was a famous Portuguese poet. He had heard about what was happening in Fatima, but of course he didn't believe it. So he was 30 miles away in a town, sitting on his balcony with his wife and his mother-in-law, and they witnessed the miracle of the sun. He was one of many witnesses from as far away as 30 miles that said they saw the sun. So that's how we know that it was seen beyond just the area where Our Lady was appearing. He too realized there was something about this, some reason why he saw this. He went on to become a Catholic eventually, and then he wrote the beautiful song, the Fatima Ave, that is sung at Fatima every single night during the big candlelight rosary processions where they process the statue of Fatima around the cova and they sing that song. So his legacy lives on, having done something with seeing the miracle. This man here is Mario Godino. He was 25 years old at the time. He had a car. He was very proud of his car. He was going to school for engineering. He was another one who was an atheist, didn't believe, but he was more focused on, his studies and going forward. But his mother had heard about what was going on in Fatima. So every month she insisted that he take her there so that she could, be present at the apparitions. They actually got a chance to speak to the 3 children in June, and they were very wealthy. And the children, he thought they were just a bunch of country bumpkins. But he kept bringing his mother. In August, the children had been arrested by the local mayor, so they were in jail during the time of the apparition. But people still gathered at the site of the apparitions. They witnessed an orb of light coming down. They saw the tree, the holm oak tree, kind of depressing as if somebody was standing on it. And again, these petals of rose petals were coming down. People would try to grab them, but they would disappear. Well, Mario was there with his mother that day, and she was cured of a brain tumor. But he still didn't believe. And so in October when he came, he was sitting in his car. Everybody was gathered, but he was in his car, and then he started to hear the crowds roaring. He got out of his car to look up. He said, I looked up and I saw that sun like I've never seen it before, and then I believed. And he knew that he was not being hypnotized, or he said, I knew that this was real. So Our Lady had said she would perform a miracle so that all would believe. But what he did is he left and he ended up going back to his schooling. He got married, and he never, ever told anybody about what he saw. He just kept it to himself. I mean, I always wonder what was his conversations with his mother. I mean, she was there too. They both saw it. She was cured of a tumor, but he never spoke about it. When our founder, John Haffert, was asking people to, he was trying to find witnesses to the miracle of the sun because he wanted to create a book. And this man came forward and he kind of gave a brief little testimony, and then that's all he did. But then he came back and he told the whole story that he had been coming every month with his mother. He said, now I'm an old man. My mother's gone, my wife is gone, and all I have left to do is think about eternity. And he said, I'm ashamed and sad that I didn't do anything with this. And so, again, God is performing miracles every day. There's still physical cures that happen at Fatima. You hear about cures happening all over, like Lourdes, France, and people going to the hospital thinking they're dying, and all of a sudden they're healed. So God is working in our lives all the time. He's performing miracles, but it's what we're going to do with them. The message of Fatima, is really an invitation to participate with the Blessed Mother in her role here on earth. She's interceding for us. She's trying to bring souls to heaven, and she's wanting us to participate in that by offering ourselves to the Lord every day. The Fatima message began in 1916 with an angel of peace that came and appeared to the children. And so people don't even know that a whole year before the apparition started, an angel appeared to these 3 children. They were only 6, 8, and 9 years old. He came to them 3 times, and in the third time he came, he brought them Holy Communion. So this was the first miracle that was performed. He had a host and a chalice, and the host was dripping blood into the chalice. And he taught them these beautiful prayers to pray. If God deserves our worship, Jesus is present in all the tabernacles of the world, and that he deserves that we come and bow down before him. So he gave the host to Lucia because she had received her first Holy Communion. And he gave the contents of the chalice to the other two children. Then they bowed down and imitated him, placed their foreheads to the ground and prayed this angel prayer, offering sacrifice for all of those who don't believe in the Eucharist, who are sacrilegious when they receive the Eucharist, who are outraging Jesus in his images, and who have indifference when they go to receive him. So this is a prayer of adoration and worship, and also making reparation. And so the children learned very quickly that this message had something to do with the Eucharist. And I have to say that the angel left them feeling like they were in some kind of a supernatural stupor. Francisco would say that they couldn't even talk or walk. And the funny thing is they never said a word to anybody. They didn't tell their parents about this. However, when they met with the Blessed Mother, she was very light and easy to approach. And she was very, she left them feeling joyful. But the angel left them feeling like they were in some kind of a, like they called it a supernatural stupor, this aura about them where they couldn't walk or talk. But the angel apparition was the start of the Fatima apparitions, and so a lot of people don't know that this was the beginning of it. When the Blessed Mother appeared to them, I'm sorry I don't have a better picture than something from a childhood color book, but Lucia described her as like the purest crystal glass with the brightest rays of the sun coming through. She was just filled with light, radiated the light of God. This is, so her main message to us is to pray the rosary. She came to her first question, are you willing to offer yourselves to God and bear patiently with all the sufferings he wills to send you for the conversion of sinners? Lucia said that was the essential message. That's the way that we are going to become holy, by uniting our sufferings to Jesus and offering them up every day. And then the children once again fell to the ground when she had spread her hands, and this light radiated from her where they witnessed God. They actually witnessed what heaven looked like. And they said, "O most Holy Trinity, I adore you, my God, I love you in the most blessed sacrament." So Mary and Jesus, Mary is reflecting Jesus. And these children, they were so young, but they just said it automatically just poured out of them. They didn't know where this prayer arose from, but it came up out of them, and this is called the Eucharistic prayer. Also at the first apparition, she talked about, Lucia had asked about a young girl who had died. Her name was Amelia. And there was some scandal going on in the village about this. It was a very small town, but something Amelia had done, and when she died suddenly, people were very concerned about her. So she asked about another gal who had died, and the Blessed Mother told her she was in heaven. And then she asked about Amelia, and she said she will be in purgatory until the end of time. That sounds really horrendous. What on earth did Amelia do at age 18 that would cause her to be in purgatory until the end of time? Later, when Lucia was asked this question, she said it may have been that she deserved hell, but she was saved because of someone's prayers. So she ends up in purgatory, but she's going to be saved. And we do know that it had something to do with impurity. I've read that she possibly was having an affair with a married man. And so she died suddenly without having confessed that sin. But she still, Lucia said it's an act of mercy of God that she ends up in purgatory instead of eternity in hell. She also talked about, the children had experienced heaven. During the July apparition, she showed them a vision of hell. These kids were so young. We don't want to talk about hell because we don't want to think that it exists. But she was pointing out there's a purgatory. She showed them heaven, and she also showed them hell. This is a pretty good picture of what the children witnessed, a sea of fire. They saw souls that had gone there that were blackened, and they were rising up out of the flames. And then they could distinguish the souls of the people from the beasts and the demons, because the demons looked like animal beasts that they've never seen before. They were so frightened by it that they said they would have died of fright had the Blessed Mother not been with them. St. Faustina had a similar vision of hell just 17, 18 years later. Her vision was very similar. She described the sea of fire. But she also experienced the 7 ways in which you suffer in hell, including that you constantly smell sulfur and you're constantly in the presence of the devil. I mean, if you ever look at her diary and read her vision of hell, it's very similar. She was an adult, of course, so she was given more understanding about this. But Jacinta was so horrified by what she saw, it changed her entire life. She spent the rest of her life offering any suffering she could so that people wouldn't have to go there. And she said, why doesn't God show hell to everybody so they would never commit another sin? So Jacinta became one who took on really extraordinary sacrifices because she was so drawn to the fact that people can actually end up here. And she wanted people to go to heaven. So if we're opening our hearts to God and we're going to follow Jesus Christ, what's going to happen is we're going to expand our hearts to love everybody. We want everybody to be with Him. And so this is something, the first and second commandments, to love the Lord your God above all else and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's what happens when you take on the heart of Mary. When you're following Jesus Christ, your heart expands with love to the point where you're praying for other people you don't even know. During the August apparition, Our Lady did appear to the children after they got out of jail, and she said to them, pray and make sacrifices for those who have nobody to pray for them. Because so many people go to hell because there's nobody to pray and offer sacrifice for them. We can look around the world and see how many people, homeless people, I live in Minneapolis, homeless people on the corners and people on drugs, that the reason they're looking for money is because they're drug addicted. And you see, I've been in California many times. My son's a Marine, and so I go out to California a lot. You go out to the beaches, and it's just filled with people who are so lost and again, homeless and mentally challenged, and I think they have no one to pray for them. How many young people out there are really struggling? There's so much suicide. People are falling into depression and hopelessness and despair at a rapid rate, and they don't know God. But we can pray for them. We can offer prayers and sacrifices. And I feel my heart expanding whenever I pray for anybody out there who doesn't have anybody to pray for them. This is how we're helping bring about the kingdom of God on earth. And Mary is trying to teach us this. She's trying to teach us through her own immaculate heart. She's the perfect model of the disciple of Jesus Christ. And she was given a special role by God to be part of our lives. She's very much active in our world today, and she came to Fatima to help us understand why her immaculate heart is the way to God, and that she will never lead us astray. She told Jacinta during the June apparition, I will never forsake you. My immaculate heart will be your refuge and the way that will lead you to God. She doesn't want us to go anywhere else but to God, and she's always a refuge for us. So to take refuge in that heart. The 3 children, I just want to talk a little bit about what happened to them. This picture, a very famous picture of the 3 children, that's against the wall of Francisco and Jacinta's house in Fatima. It was taken after the vision of hell. So people will say, how come they look so sad and they look so angry? Well, back then when you took a picture, you had to stand there for like 20 minutes while the flash worked. So they were standing for a long time and they were getting impatient, but they'd also just witnessed hell. And so they were not really happy having to deal with the pilgrims. But I want to talk about what happened to each of them. St. Francisco and Jacinta, of course, are saints. They were declared saints in 2017 by Pope Francis, and they're the youngest non-martyr saints in the history of the Church. They didn't become saints because they saw Our Lady. They became saints when they were studying the virtue of these children. They rose rapidly in holiness by following what Our Lady had asked them to do, by opening their hearts to God. During the time when they were in jail, the mayor was threatening to kill them if they didn't tell the secrets, if they didn't say they were lying, and put this whole messy thing to an end. But they refused to lie and say, no, it's not true. So he threatened to boil them in oil. He took Jacinta first. Francisco and Lucia truly thought she was going to her death. Then they came and got Francisco. Lucia was the last one. All three of them willingly went to their death. So they were accepting martyrdom that day. They were accepting that they would die for Christ rather than tell a lie. And that was one of the things that they looked at when they declared the two youngest ones saints, that they were willing to accept martyrdom. Francisco, he could never hear the angel or Our Lady speak. And it's because Francisco was kind of he was picked on. He never understood his studies. He didn't get First Communion even at age 9 because he couldn't understand his catechism. He was a very gentle and humble little boy. He didn't care if he lost at the games. He would just shrug his shoulders and not care. He was kind of, possibly he had ADHD or some kind of a learning disability. And I do believe the reason that he didn't hear the angel or the Blessed Mother, he might have jumbled up what they were saying and not gotten it right. But he heard God in his heart. He felt the presence of Jesus when he received the Holy Eucharist from the angel. He felt Jesus within him, but he said he didn't know how. Whenever Lucia would come to visit him when he was sick with the Spanish flu in his bedroom, and she had just come from communion, he said, "Come closer to me," because he wanted to feel Jesus. So he learned to hear and love the Lord in his heart. He was drawn to pray often before the tabernacle at the church, and he also became very confident in his prayers. He was so young, and so many people were coming to Fatima, and they'd come before him, and they'd kneel down before him and say, ask him to pray for something. And he would take off his hat and kneel down before them and pull out his rosary. There were times when prayers that he brought to the Eucharist, he would come back and say it would be answered. There was one time, there was of course this was during World War I, there was a young couple in the Fatima village. The man was going to be sent to war. The wife had a very serious illness and they had a young child. Francisco was overhearing Lucia talk about it with her sister. He took it to prayer. He came back and he said, "Tell Teresa that this family will be okay." Well, the next day that man got really sick and he wasn't able to go to war. So see how God used one suffering, his sickness, in order to bring out a greater good. The wife was cured of her illness and the family didn't have to go. So Francisco just had confidence that God was going to answer that prayer. There was another time a woman came to him. People would come and sit with him in his bedroom when he was sick. This was a year after the apparitions ended, when Jacinta and Francisco both concocted the terrible Spanish flu that was raging through the world. The Spanish flu was also one of the reasons why World War I came to an end, because there were so many people getting sick that there were no soldiers left. They just didn't have the energy to keep fighting. So God used this great illness that raged throughout the world to end a war. So Francisco and Jacinta both got this pandemic. He would be laying in his bedroom and people would come and sit with him and they'd say, "There's something about Francisco. There's something about it when you're sitting next to him." And one lady, her husband and son had had a terrible falling out. She came and asked Francisco if he would pray for them to be reconciled. And he said, "I'll ask God when I get to heaven." On the day that he died, the son came home and the father and the son reconciled. And so I pray to St. Francisco all the time, and I also challenge him. I say, "You helped that lady that day you went to heaven, and I need help right now," and he'll often come through for me. So he's 9 years old when he died, and he's a great saint we should be looking to, St. Francisco. He truly also helps, he intercedes a lot for people who are addicted with drugs and alcohol, and he helps with family fights and family discord and things. He helps pray to him when you need peace for something going on in your family, or when parents out there who are dealing with their children who have maybe gone off the rails here, and you're praying for them to return to God. So he's a great saint to pray to for that. I'm going to go quickly because I know I'm beyond my 30 minutes here, but Jacinta became a great sufferer. She took on unbelievable sufferings for the Lord. When Our Lady came and said, "I'm going to take Francisco to heaven soon," she asked if she wanted to go to heaven or if she would stay longer. And she said she would stay longer. So she died a year after Francisco. She had this terrible open wound from the suffering of this flu, and it had attacked her lungs. She had pleurisy, and they had done surgery on her that she knew wasn't going to do any good. They didn't have anesthesia at the time. They removed one of her ribs. And she just kept, during the operation, she just kept saying, "It is for you, Jesus, it is for you, Jesus." But, you know, it didn't cure her. It left her with a gaping wound in her side. And so when her family would be bringing her to the hospital in Lisbon, there was this terrible, terrible smell because she had rotting flesh and bacteria. And so when they get on the trains, people would move away from her. But she was so humble and just, you know, went forward knowing how much this bothered people. Even the place she was supposed to stay in Lisbon, this home, they didn't want her there because of the terrible smell. So she ends up being taken care of. This woman, Mother Godino, she was a nun, and it was in an orphanage, and Mother Godino would come and sit with her, and she learned many things about Jacinta that she was able to report once they were studying her life. Jacinta would often be in the hospital, and the doctors would come in, and, you know, at that time, just like now, there was a lot of godlessness and atheism in the scientific community and the medical community. And Jacinta would say, these doctors don't know how to cure people because they don't have God in them. We kind of saw that during the COVID. They didn't know how to treat this. They didn't even know how to advise us correctly on what was going on with this pandemic. We were getting so much confusion. And so she would see this. And this one doctor came to her and asked her if he was someone who had faith. And he asked her if he would pray for her when she got to heaven. And she said, "You will be there before me." And he died a week later from the flu. And that happened a second time. A doctor had come to her and asked her to pray for him, and he said, "You will die." She told him, "You will die before me." He died a couple weeks later, as well as his daughter. And so she had somewhat of a mystical ability to read souls, and she had these mystical qualities. On the day she died, her body took on the smell of flowers. This is her in her casket. She was laid in a casket in Lisbon for like 10 days because so many people were coming to see her. But she always smelled like flowers. Then in 1935, they exhumed her body, and they were going to move her to Fatima, and they found that she was incorrupt, and they still could smell the flowers. And so Jacinta also was declared a saint in Francisco in 2017. She's a great one also to pray for people who are, she intercedes for people who are in prison. And I always pray to her in Francisco for people who are in prison by drugs and alcohol. Because it's the same type of prisoner, people who are in prison by mental illness. So Jacinta is truly the youngest non-martyr saint. Lucia went on to have to spread the devotion to the Immaculate Heart throughout the world. She's the one who I learned what it means to follow God every day when I was asked to edit her biography that was written by the nuns who lived with her for 55 years. And she teaches us what she called the long, slow martyrdom of daily living. Her life, she went on to become a nun in the Carmelite order. She learned how to read and write. She wrote 60,000 letters communicating with many politicians and world leaders, all the popes and bishops, and lots of very famous people would come to see her. Salvador Dali, are you guys familiar with who Salvador Dali is? The famous artist. He was a very popular artist in the 1960s. He was an abstract artist. He went to see Lucia. And he actually converted to the Catholic faith before he died just from seeing her. He was very famous in New York, part of the elites, someone that, you know, didn't believe in God, but she had a real uncanny ability to be able to speak to people, and she just stood for the truth. But she wrote her memoirs in 1935 to 1941. They've sold 19 million copies worldwide. She died in 2005. At the age of 97. So when Our Lady had told her during the June apparition, "I will take Francisco and Jacinta soon to heaven, but you will have to stay here a while longer." She had no idea it was going to be 88 more years. But I do believe that when more and more of her writings are unpacked, she will possibly be considered a doctor of the church someday. And I just want to quickly show pictures of, the statue on the right, the one on the left was the first statue that was carved, some kind of a rendition of Our Lady of Fatima. It was carved by a famous artist named Jose Medin. He was known as the Michelangelo of Portugal. When Lucia saw the statue, she said, it's very beautiful, but that's not how she looked. So he sat with her, or she sat with him, and she taught him what Our Lady really looked like. He created this Pilgrim Virgin statue that our founder commissioned. It left Fatima in 1947, and we take this statue all over the world. I know it was here in Wisconsin Rapids last October, I believe, traveling around to different parishes. This is primarily how we were able to spread the message of Fatima throughout the world after World War II. This statue has traveled to over 100 countries around the world. It was crowned in front of Vladimir Lenin's tomb in Russia in 1991 after the Communist Party was driven out and the godless government was replaced by one word, freedom of religion. It travels by airplane whenever we go overseas. Often it has an escort, police escort. This picture on the bottom right was the New York City Police Department that escorted the statue. So here it is from different pictures from throughout, I think it was Saigon, and I think this was in Brazil, and then that was Colombia, the one on the left. So she's been to over 100 different countries and continues to travel today to help spread this message. This statue is also known as the Weeping Madonna. We don't like to promote that she cries, but she does. This is the exact same statue. The one on the left, you can see the tears, her eyes look like they're puffed up. You can see the tracks of tears coming down and dripping off her chin. We've documented that she's cried 33 times. One of the ones that made the news was back in 1972 in New Orleans. It made newspapers all over the country. That was during the time when the Supreme Court was discussing the abortion issue when Roe v. Wade was legalized in January of 1973. We don't know if that's why she cried, but communism in the Soviet Union killed 64 million people. This country has killed 68 million unborn children. So we should be horrified by the fact that, whether the killing's being done in a gulag in the Soviet Union or in an abortion clinic in our own country, it's the same human being that's being killed. So we don't know why she cries, and we don't usually like to tell people about it because they'll come looking for a weeping statue instead of the message of what Our Lady wants from us. These are just a few pictures from Fatima. If you go there, the children's houses are still there. This is the area where they would graze their sheep. It looks very much like it did 106 years ago. This is where that statue sits at the site of the apparitions. That's where Our Lady appeared. The stump of the home oak tree that she appeared on is underneath the statue, what's left of it. And then this picture is a preserved home oak tree. Of course, it's huge now after 100 years, but that's the type of tree that she stood on. And then this great basilica was built. Millions and millions of people come to Fatima every year of all different religions. So that's my story. I hope you will know something a little more about St. Francisco, St. Jacinta, and Venerable Sister Lucia, and the story of what happened at Fatima 106 years ago. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. All right. Well, happy Thanksgiving. I know you got a big 5-day break coming up.
You too.